Well, it's supposed to be recording there,
Oh,
not.
okay.
All right. Yeah. All right. So contentions. An example. So your contentions are essentially your arguments or why you think the resolution affirms or negates. So in the example given, homework sucks or homework takes too much time would be the contentions because those are the reasons why you would affirm the resolution that homework should be abolished. More generally, contentions are the arguments to why you affirm or negate. And these are supported by cards, organized into subpoints. Everyone good with cards? Cool.
Do you actually need a card for like everything, or could you make a case like off of just hypothetical?
I would, okay,
Yeah, go ahead.
okay. I think your case should have evidence somewhere in it. Especially, okay, I guess it depends on the topic. I think on topics that lean more philosophically, you should still have evidence, but it doesn't have to be like empirical evidence. Like doesn't have to be like studies about the world necessarily. I think on a topic like the one we're debating here, where we talk about like a country doing some action over another action, then you should definitely be reading evidence about things like economic growth or environmental protection. To the question, can you run things that are just like not evidence? Yes. So you can like also mix both. You can also read, just like come up with arguments and just write them down if nobody else is saying them. I do that sometimes, and those can be like subpoints in your contentions.
Another thing is that like you can like, for example, let's say you have like a contention and two subpoints under it, and you want to make it more clear with like a link or impact between your two subpoints. You can like read the first card on your subpoint A, and then say like end quote, start like give your own little analysis about like what it means and how it relates to your to your subpoint B, and then read the second card.
Yep. Is that, yep.
Well, okay, this is like not on the same topic, but you mentioned like end quote, quote.
Yeah.
I think you can do it both ways, which is more correct.
Well, like it's like quote to start it and then end quote to stop reading it. Honestly, you don't really need to
Yeah.
say that. I hardly do. Just
I-
some people do for clarity.
Yeah.
It's like a personal preference.
We'll talk about end quotes later today as well. But the main, like, they're for clarity, so if you're making it pretty obvious to the judge that you're not reading a card anymore, that should be sufficient.
Yeah.
Alright. Cards are just blocks of evidence for those who don't know. And contention structure. So, you want to tell a story through link chains in your contention. Subpoint A should link to subpoint B, should link to subpoint C. We will go more in depth with this with the contention lecture today. For now, we'll focus on the structure in the case itself. So A tends to isolate the problem and generally link it to the resolution. So that's the really long tagline example that we gave earlier. B tends to point out uniqueness the specific topic has to the asked argument. And C tends to identify a harmful impact.
Can we do an example of this, like with a silly argument?
Sure. Putting it all together. Anyways, silly argument.
Does anyone have a hot take that is not political?
Pineapple doesn't belong on pizza.
Sure.
Okay, great. Okay. Pineapple doesn't belong on pizza. This is a hot take because it's also wrong.
That's correct.
You're welcome. Okay. Can someone give me an argument why this might be true?
Acid reflux.
Okay. Why does that mean it doesn't belong on pizza?
So I don't want to get acid reflux when I'm eating pizza.
Okay.
Or like, what if it's acidic, so it hurts your teeth?
Yes. Acidity in general. Contention on
Acidity.
acidity.
Okay, awesome. Yes, that's how you spell that. 1, acidity. What happens because the pineapple is acidic?
Yes.
Okay, mouth hurt. Why is this bad? Hurt, yes.
10 million people die a year.
Hurt. Pain.
Pain, dentist, bankruptcy.
Okay. Dentist, bankruptcy. Okay, this is a little extreme. When you're making arguments, obviously there aren't super serious arguments to make on this. Usually in a topic you will have serious arguments where your impacts will be like something like this, so like maybe like poverty or like unemployment, climate change. Those are all impacts that would like have some big magnitude. This one we kind of just like made it up, but do you see the idea how we're getting from one step to another? These things, these little arrows that I drew, of how this causes this are the links.
Yeah. And your contentions should flow together like this. They shouldn't just be like an arrangement of cards that somewhat relate to the affirmative side. They should flow together and be specific towards the contention itself. Any questions? Ultimately, structure, again, varied, but you need to prove. What you do need to prove can vary, yes. Okay. The baseline objective is to provide evidence to prove the contention correct. Again, we just talked about evidence being somewhat. But for now, just, yeah. Should always look for more. You can do this by isolating evidence in a specific story into a specific story. Like the example we gave earlier talked about, like the first subpoint was literally just like a news article about a civilian losing a family member to a targeted strike. So by isolating evidence like this, you can create a story in your contentions. And isolate evidence that relates to your framework, obviously. And this is very important in Lincoln-Douglas debate. Key takeaways. Contentions are the arguments for why you affirm or negate, so you must provide evidence to prove the contention is correct through cards.
Evidence can be like evidence, or it can be analysis.
Yeah.
Yes.
Always try to make your contentions into a story that isolates specific links to the resolution and impacts that relate to your framework. If your framework is about consequentialism, but your impacts are about how the resolution violates some social contract theory, you don't really have good case structure. All right. Is everyone good with case structures and the aspects of cases? Any questions? Cool. So there are 3 reasons why cases are super important. Having a good case will be super beneficial to you while debating. The first being bias, the second being time skew, and the third being general persuasion. On bias, so every topic will have a bias towards the AF and the neg. So I'm going to show you a couple topics, and I want you guys to respond whether you think it's AF bias or neg bias.
Justice requires open borders for human migration. This is one of your potential topics for January 5th.
Yeah, they're all potential topics.
Raise your hand if you think this is biased for the AF.
Okay, raise your hand for neg.
Okay.
AF wins. European Union has an obligation to accept climate refugees. AF, raise your hand. Neg, raise your hand. AF. Resolved, the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States ought to be term limited. AF, neg. So, a clear trend, a lot of resolutions tend to be AF biased because of the time advantage that the neg has while actually debating. This makes it vital that the AF takes the full advantage of the 6 minutes they have so they can make a strong case, as the neg's case will be much shorter. All right, so we mentioned time skew a lot. This is what we're specifically talking about, is between the NR and the 1AR, when the neg has 7 minutes to give their constructive and refute the affirmative 6-minute constructive, but the AF only has 4 minutes to go through 7 minutes of content. So obviously this is the 1AR is a very tough speech, and it's the main reason that the AF struggles, or not main, but it's one of the main reasons why the AF struggles while debating. Time skew. So the AF has a lot more content to respond to on a short time frame, as we just mentioned. The neg is good at coverage. The AF, if the neg is good at coverage, the AF will have a very hard time keeping up line-by-line debate. This is one of the reasons that the last speech that the AF has is generally not line-by-line, because there's just like not really a good way to do that as your last speech. And this is where the case comes in. If the AF case has a lot of content and the content is effectively linked and isolated, the neg will have a much harder time putting arguments on your subpoints. The AF will always be at a disadvantage in this sense, so if the AF case is bad, in the sense of time skew, if the AF case is bad, it makes it that much easier for neg to apply generic arguments to the subpoints and drown out the AF. So think about like your debate rounds and your various opponents and however many times you've heard like the same block for the same contention. This is essentially what I'm talking about with generic arguments. If the neg can just like apply these 3 like random arguments to any argument within your contention level, then your argument isn't specific enough. Does that make sense?
It's almost like, think of, we'll be talking about on this in the topic analysis about being specific in your arguments, because it avoids stuff like that where if you just talk about environmental protection is good and you don't talk about specific industries where you could increase environmental protection, then the net can just read blocks about like preferring economic development over it.
Yeah. So, did we just do this? Yeah, we did. So, persuasion is the next reason why cases are so important. The whole point of the debate is for the judge to believe your arguments. So if your case arguments are confusing or don't link to the resolution, the judge will be as confused as the opponent is. Your responses and argumentation can only take you so far if the judge has nothing to vote on based on your case. So make your case arguments sound and persuasive. It will be essential to winning rounds. So we're going to go to the next section and kind of recap the strategies we went over in this presentation / go over new strategies potentially. So on definitions, we talked about using lengthy definitions to widen or narrow the scope of the debate. And lengthy isn't like necessarily true in this instance. It doesn't need to be a lengthy definition, but use definitions strategically to take advantage of vague words in the resolution and use that as additional offense for yourself. Again, not applicable to every resolution. For the framework, the value should be an inherent good, and the criterion should prove how doing the criterion achieves the value, and you can strengthen the criterion by proving efficiency. Everyone good on this? Just a recap. Cool. On contentions, you need to isolate evidence that links to the resolution and or proves uniqueness, tell a story with the subpoints, and general AF, focus on fitting content, general neg, focus on shorting case and maximizing time for refutations. All right, so that pretty much concludes the case recap lecture. So any questions, comments? Cool.
Next
All right.
up, next up is topic analysis.
Sweet.
Next up is, wait, are we going to do questions?
Well, yeah, we're gonna, yeah, okay. So, what to expect from the rest of this camp? Since many of you already have experience with LD, and even for those who don't, we want to focus on strategy rather than telling you like what our framework is, which we kind of did this lecture, we realized, but it's the first lecture. So yeah, the camp is gonna focus a lot on strategy and a lot on how you can weigh impacts and things you can do in round to win and out of round, I guess. We want you guys to be able to change and mold your cases based on what you need in round. So we're going to be focusing on a lot of drills, case writing, research, and the normal debate stuff associated with that. Practice rounds and drills will be very important in the next couple days to try to get those cases done once we decide on the due dates. I don't know when they are. But overall, have fun. This is just camp. Don't take it too seriously. It's the middle of June, end of June, so.
Okay, also, the due dates are, you will have one case done by Monday, which is a quick turnaround, but you'll have time tomorrow to work on them, and we will also have one-on-ones with you tomorrow to help you work on them. We don't expect these cases to be, like, literally the best case we've ever read, given that you've had, like, 2 days to make them.
Yeah.
We'll assign you a side, so half of you will have app, half of you will have neg, so we are able to run a practice run on Tuesday, and then by Wednesday, you will have the other side done. And again, we have time blocked out for you to work on it, and then also a good chunk of time blocked out for us to help you one-on-one with your second case.
Yep. Sweet. All right.
Do we want to assign sides before
Yeah, we
we
can
talk
do
about
that.
topic analysis?
Sure.
Okay.
Half you get on one side, half you get on the other.
No. What if we just did like
All right,
alternating?
fine.
Okay. App, Heidi, neg, Kira, app, Jack, neg, where, app, Jagger, neg, Sarah, app, neg, Josh. Okay. Is everyone clear? Does everyone know what side they're going to be? Okay.
For those who are online, we will text, or what is it, Google Classroom it?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll Google Classroom your sides after day one. All right, so topic analysis.
True. Okay.
Alrighty.
Is how are we feeling after case structure / recap?
Pretty eloquently titled, if you ask me.
Also now it's going to be getting a lot more in depth because that's like general overview and review of what you guys probably generally already know.
Yeah.
Can I talk about the China slide with the picture of China? Okay, cool.
Everyone knows, has seen the topic. We're gonna go over it,
We'll
but
also mention it after.
yes, okay.
We're going to do a couple of like little mini things in this lecture. We're also going to ask you questions. If you answer the question, there's no wrong answer to the question. We are going to throw you candy. Okay, cool. So your topic is the People's Republic of China ought to prioritize environmental protection over economic growth. Who here thinks this is AF biased?
Egg bias.
Okay, I see less hands raised in favor of AF than we had before. We felt much stronger about the other resolutions, which is why we picked this, because we think that there's generally good ground on both sides. There are 4 terms in the resolution that you need to know. We'll go over all of them. First off, People's Republic of China. It is probably what you think of when you think of China. This does not include Taiwan. Yeah. So, question: is this debate just about China? Why or why not? I saw your hand first.
No, because it also shows the responsibility China has on other nations as well.
Yes, great answer. Okay, so yeah, China being one of the largest economies in the world, or the largest, depending on what metric you use, is obviously heavily integrated with the rest of the world, both in terms of climate change. We understand how that impacts everything in the world because, like, we all have the same, we all live on Earth. And then, in terms of economic growth, when China's economy tanks, that also has implications on the rest of the world because of how heavily integrated the country is with, like, trade, for example, with other regions.
I get this slide. So prioritize is to treat as more important. This does not mean this is the only thing you do. A lot of topics will tend to have this like type of like aspect of the resolution where you're asked to choose one over the other. And a lot of mistakes, or a lot of debaters make the mistake of assuming that the AF always has to do one aspect of the resolution, or the neg always has to do the other. So this means the debate should examine when they conflict. So as a debater, you should assume that China on both sides has the option to do either. So when should I choose this environmental policy over this economic policy? And the debate shouldn't always assume that AF will always pass environmental policy or that neg will always pass economic policy.
Question: what is an example of something that causes economic growth but hinders, like, environmental protection?
Logging.
What did you say?
Logging.
Yes, so true.
Yep.
Everyone?
Like expansion of fossil fuel production industries.
Yes.
Yes.
Fossil fuels are bad for the environment. Okay, cool.
Samuel,
I can
this?
take these. Yeah. So next up is one of the terms you're going to have to debate in favor of, environmental protection. And one key thing to know about this is that environmental protection is kind of vague in how we protect the environment, what extent that protection is. In environmental science, there's kind of two competing ideas. And this is from the National Park Service, so it's kind of US-centric, but it's not specifically about US policy. It's just how we go about protecting the environment in general. There's two different ideas for it. There's conservation or preservation. And so both terms do involve protection, but to put simply, conservation seeks the proper use of nature. So we can still use nature for our benefit as long as we use it responsibly and sustainably. And then there's also preservation, which seeks to protect nature entirely from use by humans and to not let it be used at all. And so both of those are types of environmental protection, and this kind of begs the question of, does the AF have to defend both of them or one of them, and what does it look like? So it could be beneficial for the AF to defend a sustainable use approach, saying we can still use the environment to our benefit as long as we protect it. And you want to be prepared to defend a reason why that's how we should view environmental protection compared to preservation, because negative could get up there, once again, about definitions, and say, no, environmental protection is about preservation, and this means we're not going to be able to use these resources, and yada yada. You could also run a definition, like National Park Service, saying both of these are types of protection, we need to debate about both of these and involve both of them in the conversation. So, next up is environment, did you... Okay. Can you go back one? Okay. And then, yeah, one is more biased than the other. So now we're going to be going over some general arguments about environmental protection. Then we're going to get on to economic benefits and economic growth, what that means, and general arguments for it and in favor of it.
Also, a note on that definition thing. If you choose a definition that is more strategic for you, but there is another definition that is legitimate, so saying that I'm only doing like one thing as opposed to both, and neg gets up there and is like, wait a minute, you can't do that because this definition also exists and it's backed by like different climate organizations. The response to that can also be that you can justify definitions, and this is like the third way that we didn't talk about earlier, by explaining how they would be better for debate. That is, if you choose a definition that is too restrictive for your side, then that's like unfair. So definitions that generally give both sides decent ground are also like ways in which you can justify them.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Is that like a theory argument, or is that not something that is a good idea?
Okay,
Well,
so
when you're kind of gets to that area.
Yeah.
You kind of can't avoid it.
Yeah, like
Theory argument, but it's not like the theory that people get mad at.
yeah, like yeah, it is theory argument, but you don't call it theory. Really, it's stuff that just happens because that's how definition debates function. Okay, so is there any other questions? Okay. Okay, so environmental protection. So some of the reasons that we should prefer environmental protection is that damage to the environment can upend industries that rely on natural resources. So this can cause shortages and lower quality material. So if we don't protect the environment, it doesn't matter if we're prioritizing economic growth because the economy can be damaged.
An example that someone said earlier about logging.
Is this?
Yeah. So like deforestation reduces the actual amount of natural resources harvest, which
Yeah.
causes shortages.
You can also think of other stuff like mining. China is really prominent with mining and platinum, for example. And so one of the things to take into account is that if we don't use this sustainably, then it's going to result in lower grade material, and we need to find a way to benefit our economy without depleting all these natural resources because they're going to run out. Next up is harms towards life expectancy. And so when we're talking about life expectancy, poverty isn't the only determinant that goes into life expectancy. So air quality and access to clean drinking water are important, but also when we're talking about poverty, when the people are in poverty, the environmental impacts tend to affect them more. So when we're looking at access to clean drinking water, that's something that can disproportionately affect impoverished people. And there's going to be some statistics coming up that show, depending on where you live in China, your air quality is drastically different, and that can have implications on your health. So for example, Beijing has a 5-year lower life expectancy than southern China, and it's specifically due to air pollution. And then is immediacy. So this just kind of takes in general arguments about climate change, and you're able to access impacts that climate change has to the entire world. So something is, basically the argument is that it's worth taking these steps to mitigate climate change, even if it's a small expense of economic gains, because we need to prioritize environmental protection because we're on the precipice of disaster for the world and for people in this country and for people in China. And so prioritizing it is important because it's a more immediate impact that's going to get us sooner.
Another thing that you guys should notice about these examples is that a lot of when you look at the resolution, you tend to think that just has to talk about the environment and that has to talk about the economy. But a lot of these examples are related to the economy, specifically shortages and how the economic socioeconomic status of different individuals determines their life expectancy. So there's definitely ways you can weave aspects of the resolution together on both sides.
And that's something that's going to be really important, especially when we're talking about weighing arguments. If the AF just gets up there and talks about how there's going to be an increase in CO2 emissions, and that's their case, and the negative gets up there and says there's going to be this much increase in GDP, and that's their case, and they don't tell you how it's going to actually impact people's lives and harm them or help them, then there's not really a reason to vote for them. So,
Specificities.
yes, exactly. Okay, next slide. Okay, so economic growth. So the general definition of economic growth is that it's in terms of GDP, which is gross domestic product. So this is all the value of goods and services produced in that country. Now, there are competing definitions of economic gains and economic growth, but generally this is what's used to determine the health or economic health of a country. Okay, so some general arguments in favor of prioritizing economic growth. So economic growth improves quality of life. Generally, countries that have a boost in GDP or are big into trade, it results in them investing in their infrastructure and bettering their infrastructure. This can lead to better supplies and standards for emergency services, recreational activities, and just a better access to material goods. Another example is economic growth spurs innovation. So with this, when there's a lot of trade going on or we're investing in these industries, it can lead to innovation and better technology for these industries. So some examples are in the healthcare sector, in agriculture, and in environmental technology. This can be a reason that negative could argue to prefer economic benefits or economic growth because it leads to innovation in environmental sectors that can lead in the future to protecting the environment. And then last is trade. So competitive countries in like the trading, like internationally, tend to improve the lifespan and opportunities for citizens, and a booming economy makes it easier to participate in the markets. And one thing you're going to be noticing when you do research into China and what kind of country it is, it's an export economy. So it'll like manufacture goods and then export them out to other countries. So when we're looking about natural resources that they use, that's going to be big into looking at how it's going to affect their trade, because a lot of the natural resources they mine or take and then export, that leads to an increase in emissions. And in general, trade agreements and initiatives like the Belt Road Initiative, which you're going to learn about, also leads to a massive increase in emissions, but it's going to increase trade and economic benefits for the country. That's going to help the citizenry. Okay, and comparing impacts. So this is kind of something we touched on already, is that obviously there are reasons to pursue both goals. Economic growth is good, and at the same time, environmental protection is also a good thing. Neither of those are just bad, and it's probably not great to say that you should never look to all these things. That's what we talked about before, like try and find some middle ground. And so it's, you want to like compare impacts and be specific about why a certain environmental damage or a certain like boost to the economy in different sectors is more important than the harms they cite. And that's another thing, like if the AF gets up there and says there's going to be an increase in CO2 emissions and doesn't tell you how that's going to affect people, and the negative gets up there and talks about how investing in these industries is going to curb climate change and it's going to improve the healthcare industry in China and save this amount of many of lives, that's a lot more compelling than AF getting up there and just talking about CO2 emissions without explaining how it can harm people. And that's going to be demonstrated in rebuttal presentations.
Wait, I have a preface slide before you
Yes.
start talking. Preface. Okay, so we are about to tell you a bunch of historical and like current modern day context about environmental protection and economic growth in China. When you listen to this presentation, it is not important that you keep track of every single detail. This is to get an idea of what areas of debate are available to you and if any of these areas sound interesting. This is also not super comprehensive. We have an hour to talk about this. So if there are issues that you want to debate about, for example, on every single topic, I always try to make the topic oriented towards social justice. There's definitely a way to do that. So if you want to talk about like ethnic minorities in China, for example, that's something you can do, but that's something we don't necessarily talk about. Secondly, is that knowing history is not the most important part of debate. It is definitely helpful to have a store of examples that you can draw from when you are like responding to someone, for example, but it is much more important that you develop good strategy. So most of your time should not be spent reading a ton about like China, but thinking through your arguments and identifying to yourself why they're going to be strategic in a round. Yes, so don't be like too bogged up with the facts.
Well said. Alrighty. So, environmental protection in China. I have a chart here. This analyzes global carbon emissions. And you can see the top is the rest of the world. The bottom is China. China clearly makes up a very, very big majority of the emissions. So, generally though, China has declared to reduce emissions to levels allowed by the Paris Accord, but the status quo doesn't necessarily reflect that. So here's a short timeline of China climate policy. This is not comprehensive. You don't need to know this like to the T. Just be somewhat comfortable with like knowing what China has done in the past. So China is a part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, which imposed emission limits on industrialized countries. So these two, along with the Paris Accord agreement, are just examples of how many international accords that they have abided by to reduce emissions. The 2008 financial crisis is an important landmark in China's environmental policy because it pretty much reversed it. China was agreeing to all these accords. The UN Framework for Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol were both before 2008 that they like initially signed on to. They also signed on to many different plans, like 11-year plans to reduce emissions. But with the 2008 financial crisis, they kind of threw it out the window and valued economic policy over environmental policy in order to bring their economy back to, like, in not, financial crisis areas. So like most nations, China's actions are different from its stated principles. And the takeaways of this short historical timeline is that, one, China has mostly been complicit with climate accords brought forward, but they have been unable to actually deliver on the goals of the agreement. So you can look at this from two perspectives. One, China has historically valued climate policies over economic ones, and the accords are literally a testament to that. But two, in practice, China fails to reduce emissions, so prioritization may not be strong enough reason. That should not say to vote F. The financial crisis in 2008 is also a very key takeaway in the historical aspect of this resolution because it caused China to implement less restrictive economic policies that generally ignored environmental guidelines, which is the crux of this debate. This is like the perfect historical example to use for this resolution. China had to decide between economic growth or carbon reduction, and they chose economic growth, which shows that and this financial crisis also mirrors the financial damage that COVID caused, which means that it could give neg some strong historical ground, that strong economies weather against recessions, which means that in situations where you have these two in confliction, economic policies may be the better option.
Question for Candy about this slide. So Prasoon just told you that in the past, China has not followed through with its climate agreements. Is it a strategic neg argument, and this is obviously up for like your personal opinion, to say that even if China prioritizes environmental protection, they just won't do it? Yes.
So, is this the right term? Maybe that's about defining what you have to do, or like a given, like you just have to argue that prioritizing something inherently implies that it's always good, or you
Yeah.
have to look at what's a prioritization, if not like a complete concession to climate agreements, as to what represents like a move towards it, or the problematic as well as.
Good answer. I threw Candy at you then. You need to remember that. Okay. Yeah, so Heidi brought up a term called fiat. I'm going to write it down, because why not? Fiat. Does anyone know what this means in terms of a debate? Jack.
Assuming that what you state will happen, like in terms of China following through on the prioritization, that they're not going to back out of it for the terms of the debate. We're going to assume that they're going to follow through on their promise, and there's not going to be any hanky-panky going on.
Yes, can I throw the Candy?
Well said.
Yes. Awesome. Yes, that is what fiat is. Generally, I think the answer to my question is no, that is not a strategic neg argument. You can maybe argue it, but I think that there are better arguments you can make. That is that if we were to assume a world where prioritization doesn't actually mean that China will do things to prioritize climate change, then there's no debate happening. Like, the debate should be about if China were to prioritize climate change, that is to say that they're actually taking action to stop climate change, then is that better or worse than economic growth?
Right. This is a reason why like feasibility arguments are really bad in Lincoln Douglas, because you're not arguing if the resolution is like possible. You're assuming it happens to have a debate in the first place. So does fiat make sense to everyone? Cool. To learn more about the timeline, you can visit that, which will be posted on the Google Classroom. Is that you?
Yes, that is me. We're going to talk about economic growth. Okay. These are some basic this is some basic context about China's economy. One, which is what Sam mentioned earlier, is that China is a manufacturing economy. So their GDP heavily relies on their like industry and manufacturing sector. What does this mean, or what does this have implications on in terms of the debate? This is kind of open-ended, but like, given that China depends on manufacturing, maybe what is the scope of the debate? Was your hand raised? Dwyer? Okay, Kira?
I would say that it's like worldwide, considering that not only is like their economy focused on exports, but because it largely affects like so many other countries, that's probably something Hap wants to consider, that like their economic growth is something that affects the whole world.
Yes. Candy. Okay. So that's one thing, which is that if China is like a huge manufacturer of global products, then them cutting back on manufacturing has puts like stress on supply chains globally. The second thing to note about this is that if manufacturing is such a large part of China's economy, then doing the affirmative, which is to say that you prioritize environmental protection, means that you have to reduce manufacturing to some extent. Because obviously, like, this is a super energy intensive part of like a sector of the economy. So if this is causing so many like emissions, then this is probably the first thing that you're going to target. Because manufacturing is so widespread, though, this affects a lot of people in China. So that's another thing that you can think about when considering scope. Second thing on this is poverty reduction, which is that since 1978, China implemented a bunch of economic reforms to basically make the market freer. And since then, they have generally lifted a lot of people out of poverty. Estimates say like 800 million people. Now, obviously, doing the negative, which is to say, or no, doing the affirmative, which is prioritizing environmental protection, is not putting 800 million people back in poverty. Like, this is something that has happened over the past, 4 decades? But it is probably going to harm a lot of people who have benefited from the economic growth or from the institutions and jobs that were created in like those in this economic reform period that would probably have to be cut back on in the world of the affirmative. Third thing to note is development. So China invests in infrastructure development globally, which is to say that it is not just worldwide in scope because of things that China does domestically, having like ricochet effects across the world, but it is also international in scope because China literally like goes out to different countries and invests in them. And this maybe has some potential arguments on either side. Okay. Domestic impacts. We talked about poverty reduction. Some problems though is that generally when you go like super hard free market capitalism, it also causes income inequality to rise. This is a potential AF response or an AF argument you can talk about. We're also going to try to impact out poverty reduction, which I think something in debate that a lot of us think of is like, we think of poverty as the terminal impact. What I mean by that is we're like, poverty makes like 100 million people go into poverty, and that is why it is really bad. The problem is, if affirmative gets up there and says, like, climate change affects literally everyone, so 7 billion people, and that outweighs on scope, now you have nothing to rely on. So you need to explain why exactly poverty is so bad for an individual, more so than climate change is, in order to, like, win that argument. Why is poverty bad? This is also for Candy. Yes. Yes. Oh. Good throw. Okay. Hurts the least well off. Okay. One thing to note about this argument, though, why doesn't climate change hurt the least well off if it affects everyone? It does. So we need to make arguments about the severity of poverty and not just who it affects and how many people it affects, but what are the circumstances of poverty that are so bad? Yeah.
Often in create situations where like they can't afford basic goods or they have to choose between like, I don't know, like baby formula and food for themselves.
Yep. This is oh, Candy. So you want to impact out poverty to not just say poverty is bad, because obviously poverty is bad, but you should explain poverty is this bad so you can compare it to other things, which is that I think the main argument is that poverty means that you can't afford goods. What specific goods can't you afford? We have an example of like baby formula or food for your family. So you often have to make the decision about whether or not you're going to eat the next day. Yep.
It can make it so that you can't afford housing.
Yes.
So it can increase
Oh.
homelessness too.
Yes. Okay. Next is housing. Housing is expensive. People going to into poverty means they cannot afford homes. This also causes homelessness, which is a separate impact that you could also explain the severity of. What are other things that you can't afford now? Jack.
Education, both in form of college and that if you're in poverty, you're going to be working more, your children are going to be working more, they have less time to study. It just creates a cycle where people are unable to get out of poverty.
Yep. So that's a really good argument. So we have two different warrants here, which is that can't afford college. You also have no time to focus on studying, so you like would prefer not to go to college anyways because you'd rather have like money to buy food. And this is also something that you could impact out further as to why not having education is so bad. Jack told us that it causes a cycle of poverty, which means it just becomes a feedback loop back into poverty and it reproduces all of the impacts we've talked about so far. What are other things that you can't afford? That was not your hand. Okay.
I have a response.
Pursoon.
Healthcare.
Good one. Healthcare.
Not candy.
Okay. And that's really bad because you need healthcare to live a healthy life. Okay. So this is how you explain exactly why poverty is so bad. And this gives you a lot of offense against potential AF arguments, which are probably going to be like, but climate change affects everyone. But the way that climate change affects everyone, at least right now, and there are like nuances to this argument we'll talk about later, is that like your quality of life is probably slightly worse or maybe moderately worse. Like there are probably health impacts that result from climate change. There are probably like more extreme weather events. But the fact that you are able to have things like a home to live in, food to eat, are things that are much more immediate to your survival, are much more immediate to your quality of life, and maybe that's a reason why you prefer keeping people out of poverty. Does this make sense to people?
Another reason poverty might outweigh the impacts of like environmental damage. Okay, so what happens to those people in Beijing who experience like more air pollution? Where do they have to go?
A hospital.
Yeah.
And then they wouldn't be able to afford the hospital if they were in poverty.
Yeah.
So poverty people would have, they'd experience it a bit worse.
Yeah, so like you could say that like while air pollution may like marginally increase, these people will like not be in poverty and will actually be able to afford the services that can take care of them.
The thing that Catherine said about like immediacy is also like very important. Like the thing with climate change is that a lot of the impacts aren't really like they're happening right now, but not to the same extent as like people being on the streets because they can't afford something.
Real. Okay. Next part of this. And that's like the think specificity thing. So it's not specific enough just to say poverty is bad, but what exactly are the circumstances of poverty? Like usually when you see a word that is vague or that you can't attach an image of a person to, or if you can't attach an image of a person to this, then you should describe what that image looks like in terms of like material things that cannot happen anymore. Okay. Second thing on this slide is about jobs. Manufacturing, I said, was the largest like contributor to China's economy. There are 112 million Chinese workers in manufacturing. A lot of those people now lose their jobs. Let's also talk about this argument. I'm gonna go over here. Okay, so job loss. What are some reasons why, okay, this links into poverty, obviously. I'm gonna ask a different question about this, which is, why is this particularly bad for the people it affects? So why is this bad for the people who are working in manufacturing as opposed to someone who's not working in manufacturing? Dwyer?
More skilled, different jobs requiring different skills than if someone works manufacturing mainly, they could do another like a service-based job or something like that.
Yeah.
Not that like everyone who works in these jobs is assumedly in poverty, but there tends to be more low-income people considering they're not in like really high-paying jobs.
Yeah. Okay, so we heard two things, which is, okay, this is my shorthand. First, we heard from Dwyer that there's a skill transfer issue, which is that when you lose your job in manufacturing, if you spent the last 10 years of your life working in manufacturing, and especially because manufacturing is not a particularly high-paying job, it is likely that you were not, or like you don't have the necessary skills to transfer to other jobs that are that exist. There's also like the fact that there are just less jobs in the economy now also makes it harder to get a job, which means that this traps in poverty. Next thing we heard is that you have like oftentimes more low-income people working in manufacturing, which is particularly bad because now you are hurting the most vulnerable people in society. And so maybe that's a framework, or that's an argument you can make under a certain framework that's like we should protect the least well-off. So these are some arguments you can think about. And so think about specificity in terms of both who exactly does this affect. So not just people who are like a marginalized group in the population, but exactly how are they marginalized? And the second thing about specificity that you should think about is the material impacts that these have on people. Okay. Third thing on the slide is that, not pursue. Sam already talked about this a little bit, which is that GDP growth is good because you reinvest into goods and services in your economy, like infrastructure, education, innovation, etc. So, like people can drive on the road now, or people can get better education. These are all impacts that you could flesh out more. There's also a question of climate innovation. This is also something that Sam talked about, which is the idea that maybe like economic growth, even though it is really bad for the climate right now, maybe countries will innovate some sort of climate technology that will help reverse climate change to some extent. I don't know, or do something. I don't know what that technology looks like. I haven't read about it. When the economy grows and when they can invest in that infrastructure. Third thing we're going to talk about then is another thing you could think about when developing arguments, which is why would a country want to develop climate innovation? Yep.
Quality of life for its citizens.
Yes. Okay. Quality of life. I'm just going to say QOL. Yep.
I know that like a lot of places, as they become more developed, a lot of like workers and citizens try to push for it like themselves.
Yep. Good one. Any other thoughts? Yes? No wrong answers.
Money, like the money out of climate innovation, selling it, and selling it.
Yep. Good answer. Is anyone else better at throwing?
I'll try.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Okay, so another thing that you should think about are reasons why a country would do something, and not just reasons why if a country did something that these like impacts would happen. Because you should prove that there's an incentive that exists first. And to be clear, like these ones don't, those don't apply to these things because on the negative, like, or on the affirmative, like you just are cutting off economic growth. If you're making an argument like climate innovation though, you need to explain why this is likely to happen. So maybe countries have an incentive to improve their quality of life. Maybe countries, as they become more developed, this is like a popular thing. Maybe it is more profitable. What about the fact that this has not happened previously though, or that China has not followed through with its like climate agreements in the past, or is not doing that much right now in order to invest in climate innovation? Yep.
Just like off the top of my head, I would say that there's like a certain uniqueness to it. You know, like the 2008 financial crisis was something that like severely affected them. There's no reason to believe that if they have more economic stability, they won't want to push towards climate, especially if that'll be positive for them.
Yep. So, maybe in 2008, like, I went back on a lot of my promises because I was, like, literally in a recession. But if I'm economically stable and doing climate innovation would have all of these positive impacts while being, like, a productive thing to do. So, like, you have companies going out and trying to, like, innovate, like, research and development, things that are, create products that will still give you, like, lots of money. So this is still super capitalist. Then you can maybe get climate innovation that way. And so that would be a reason why you justify this. So 3 things to think about are incentives, like specificity of the populations that are being affected, and what exactly is happening in terms of material impacts. Okay, next slide.
Wait, question?
Oh, yes. So, wait, can you elaborate?
So like, let's say I argue that climate innovation is going to happen on the upside, but
Okay.
then the text says like, oh, this probably won't happen because we've observed in 2008 they didn't do this because of economic reasons. In that situation, can I just tell them directly, like, we need to prove that this will happen again in the future, or will they just say something like, oh, well, we see now that we're like in the economic recession, so you were obligated to prove that things will return to a degree, like,
Yeah.
they have to define regularity in of itself.
Yeah, my thoughts?
What I was gonna
Okay.
say is that like, something that the negative could say is that, or just like arguing against the point of climate invasion, is that just because can you repeat the question again? Sorry, lost my train of thought.
Wait, I have one thought though.
Yeah.
Okay, which is, so it is your opponent's burden of proof to explain to you why recessions are likely to continue happening at like a frequent rate. So, and maybe they make that claim that recessions are going to continue to happen. Okay, mini recessions are not the same as these. Like these are like, COVID is the other one. Like the economy going down like a little bit is not the same as what happened in COVID or 2008. If they're like recessions will happen again and they don't explain it, you can be like, you just don't have a warrant for this. You can also say, these were like anomalies. Like after 2008, countries implemented things like financial regulations so that this wouldn't happen again. After COVID, I don't know, maybe pandemic response is getting better, so this is less likely to happen again. Maybe every time we have like a huge recession, we learn something from it such that they become less likely in the future if they have like the same like reason why the recession happened. So maybe we're not going to have like a huge financial crisis again. Maybe we're going to be better at responding to pandemics, something like that.
One thing. Okay, so if environmental damage occurs, it's going to harm. Let's say it harms the economy, rising sea levels, or forcing people to move. It's creating a mass disruption in society. What's that mass disruption in society going to lead to? Economic instability.
Do you want a candy for that?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. So, like, you could argue that if like these recessions are still going to occur, that just shows why China needs to prioritize climate innovation, because the climate's only going to get worse if we don't, and that's going to lead to more economic instability.
I think another thing is that like if you're arguing that climate innovation will happen, and your opponent is just pinpointing or like pointing to like these severe instances where they were literally unable to do so, that's not a very good argument that your opponent's making in the first place.
Oh yeah, also, yeah, like in the interim, why can't you just like,
Yeah.
like innovation doesn't, like once you have developed things, you don't undevelop them during a recession. You still have the progress that you made in between.
There were like 14 years between that. That's plenty of time to like implement policies that
Okay.
or do whatever.
Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Next up is global economics. So we talked about how what China does affects the world. There are a couple of ways in which this happens. First is trade. Can someone explain to me what happens if China exports less? There's some word hints on the slide. Yes.
We wouldn't have the things that they produce, so the people that rely, or the countries that rely on them wouldn't have those things anymore.
Yes. Oh,
Question.
God. Yep.
What does supply chain disruption, where does that affect?
Where does that affect?
Or what's affected the most by supply chain disruption?
Oh, good question, actually. So China manufactures like predominantly tech products. What else? Great question. But it's like a lot of things like semiconductors, microchips, I don't know, other techie words. So, yeah. They also manufacture generally just like a lot of clothing, a lot of like products, basically. So you can look at the specific products they export if you want, but the idea is exactly what we just heard, which is that if you export less, then that hurts the economies and changes like the prices in countries that receive those exports. If I receive less exports from China and now I have fewer like quantities of product, what happens to the prices of those products? Yes. So true. Okay, you're on fire today. Okay, so yes, prices go up because if you have less of something and the demand is still the same, that's Travis Dawley in my mind, then the price goes up. So maybe this makes life harder for individuals in countries that are not even China because now they have to pay more for the products that they want.
Also worth noting that a lot of the countries that China like trades with are countries that are like more developing than like the United States, for example. So like having extreme supply chain disruption in areas that literally have no other alternative is very catastrophic for their economies as well.
Okay, yes. Diversification. Does anyone know what this word means in terms of trade? Yes.
Okay. I don't remember, but doesn't it like increase the number of people you treat in order to prevent diseases, supply chains?
Yes, exactly. I'm walking over to you now. You're so welcome. Okay. It only took me like 4 times to realize my mistake. Okay. Yeah, exactly that. Diversification is you trading with like a lot more countries now because you want to prevent things like this happening, where if China goes down, you like tank as well. So maybe a benefit of this, if this is a neg argument that someone makes, that this disrupts supply chains globally, and now things are more expensive. Now people who are like maybe the least well off can't get goods. Maybe the response to this is that sure, that happens in the short term, but if we realize that we're this dependent on China, then we're more likely to do things like diversify and trade with other countries that produce the same products, such that like here's the USA. This is also a reason why the USA is generally trying to limit trade with China. Here's China. Here's Pursuin country. Here's Catherine country, Cat, and here's Sam country. Okay, right now I'm trading, let's just, like, simplicity's sake. Also, these countries don't exist. But I'm trading only with China right now. China goes down. Uh-oh, that's, like, really bad for me now. Whereas if I traded with Pursuin country, Catherine country, and Sam country, Pursuin goes down. I'm like, I get hurt a little bit, but I still have Catherine country and Sam country that I'm trading with, so it doesn't affect my economy as much. It doesn't affect the citizens of my country as much. So maybe the thing is like, the response to China's economy going down is that you just trade with other countries. Okay, some examples that you can look at in the past of what has happened or what impacts have resulted when the U.S. or when other countries have like decreased trade with China is like the U.S.-China trade war. There's certainly a ton of literature on this about how when China has like traded less with us, it has done bad things. So that is something that you can look into if you want to think of examples of what would happen if China traded with us less in the future. Okay. Next thing about global economics is financial markets. If you really want to run this argument, talk to me, I guess. I don't know. It's okay. There's just like there's financial theory that's like right now we have a lot of debt. If China stops buying our debt, which is like China buys bonds from the US so we can spend money on things to help our citizens. If China stops doing that, then we can do less of that. And also inflation happens due to like a chain of events. If you want to run this argument, feel free to. I don't think inflation is run super well in debate. I think people just say inflation happens and then everyone is like, nobody cares because this isn't like a moral argument. I think that inflation is typically like really bad for people in the US right now when gas prices are really high. That obviously affects the like workers who need to drive to their job and make like minimum wage. That affects people's stores of value. So if you have $1,000 saved in like your bank account, then when inflation happens, now you have like 800 or something, I don't know. And that's also really bad for you, especially if you're like trying to make ends meet. So this is an argument you want to make. You can also look into that. Okay. Next up, economic development. Here's where we're going to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. I think this is like a whole topic of debate in and of itself. So we're not going to talk about it too much today because there are plenty of like ways in which this branches out. But generally the idea is that China is pursuing a development strategy right now called the Belt and Road Initiative, where they give loans to other countries, and you can see all of the other countries that they're kind of engaging with right here. So it's like this entire hemisphere, basically. And they give loans for these countries to develop infrastructure, and the idea is that the countries will like end up paying them back from the economic development that comes out of the infrastructure development that happens. Problem with the Belt and Road Initiative, number one, that is relevant to the debate, is that it's like huge on emissions. So like developing infrastructure is very energy intensive. You're also creating things like factories. You're creating things like energy plants, like coal plants, in order to like bring power to the country. But obviously that is also emission intensive, and so that increases significantly as China continues to pursue more and more development. Generally, there can be mutual economic benefits that come from this. So the idea is that if I create like trade routes with like Kenya or something, that is also beneficial for China because now I am dominating trade with them. And also, like, I don't know, there's more trade happening. And also I have like transportation infrastructure to move around my country more into other countries. And that is also good. Question, is China's economic growth in the interest of the world, though? Like we talked about why it could produce some mutual economic benefits. What are reasons why this might be bad? And some of them are like low-key listed on the slide. But if anyone has ideas, you get candy. Yes.
So I remember doing the NASA argument about the and the big thing here was that China's relationship with South African countries tend to be exploitative or potentially detrimental to future development or self-sufficiency. So that's potentially one thing.
Yeah. Let me write that down before I call on you, Kira. Exploitation. We're gonna just say exploit. Okay, Kira.
I know that a lot of it tends to like also be really bad for the environment. Like I've read also on the same topic something about like them extracting precious metals from South Africa and like exploiting the country for it.
Okay. Yeah, so China can also be really extractive and exploitative, like we talk about here, where. Okay, where. Yeah, where China has an incentive to get more out of the deal than the countries that they're benefiting. And so like when they go into these countries and develop infrastructure, they often do things like mine resources from these countries. So other things that they might do. Does anyone have thoughts? Oh, yes, you have thoughts.
I was gonna say also like the other area thing, if they're putting so much into other countries, if they just suddenly stop because they can't afford like their own country, that could also have harmful impacts on all the other countries that they're supporting.
Yes. Okay.
Maybe someday you'll actually.
Yeah, wait, I thought Sam was gonna start doing it.
Well, you keep on like having
Yeah.
one ready to.
Oh, I'm
throw.
so sorry. Maybe I'm just faster than you guys. Okay, yeah, so if China stops this project, so this would be a argument. So stop BRI. Other countries that relied on you for infrastructure development now no longer get that infrastructure. Why is that bad for people in that country? Maybe there are reasons why they can't access housing, education, healthcare, I don't know. Infrastructure is generally good for your economy. If infrastructure development doesn't happen, it probably causes like things like poverty to happen, things like job loss to happen, or like there aren't accessible jobs because you don't have enough infrastructure in your country, stuff like that. And so maybe that's a bad impact.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are these loans exploitative?
The loans themselves.
Like, yeah.
Okay, so if Jagger, if I pay you $10 and in 5 years you have to pay me $10 back, and then I go up to you and I say, Jagger, give me my $10, and you say, I don't have $10, what am I gonna do?
Or like, are you gonna take more?
I will be taking more from you. I'm gonna get really angry. And so the idea is that if these countries don't pay back their loans, then China seizes your assets, which means that they take, like, the airports that they built or whatever, they just, like, take control of. Here's the thing, though. This has happened twice in the history of the Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of times, China is also forgiving. So there are examples of them being exploitative. There are also examples of them during, like, COVID, for example. A lot of countries in the Belt and Road Initiative asked for things like debt relief, and China said, okay. And so, yeah, we are obviously transitioning to a world, like, maybe post-COVID. And so in that instance, there's a chance that China will be more exploitative with their loans, or more, like, demanding, or will actually seize more assets.
Also, the thing that I was like kind of leading on is like interest rates are also important parts of loaning. So, a way you could view like if China is like if China's like this like angel investor to all these countries, but has pretty like insane interest rates, then it's kind of like it's not really them helping the country; it's more them setting them up for failure type situation.
I was just gonna say, like, for another thing, you could say that it could, like, I don't know, it might tempt other countries also to, like, start, like, it might make other countries like the United States or, like, Europe to also invest and cause kind of like a Cold War situation with China and, increase tensions.
Yeah, that's another thing. And this is actually true. Like, the U.S. is really mad that China is doing this. And so, like, there have been pressures on, like, the Biden administration, for example, to pursue a development strategy similar to China's BRI and try to expand, like, their investing in development efforts across the world. I also think if other countries were to do this, like the U.S., there's a good chance that these would also be exploitative or like cause more environmental harms. And so maybe this is something that compounds in the future and creates much more harms than just the harms of the BRI right now. Another thing we can talk about is political leverage, which is the idea that if China is like, if you're dependent on China for your infrastructure, or maybe, wait, let's think of it this way. Greta, if I am giving you like $1,000 a week, and then one day I say, you have to vote for me, or otherwise I'm not going to give you $1,000, would you vote for me? Okay, for the sake of this, there is a correct answer. Okay, so I'm giving you $1,000 a week, and you're getting so much money from this. You actually depend on it for your existence. And then I'm like, you have to vote for me in my upcoming election, otherwise I'm going to stop giving you money. Yes, you would probably vote for me. So the idea is that, yes. The idea is that China now holds power over you because like you're relying on them for your infrastructure development, and you are also heavily relying on them for trade. This means that they have more influence over you in the region. What does influence look like? Maybe it means you become like a UN voting bloc. Maybe it means something else. Yes, Jagger?
So this is something like kind of related, but so the resolution is the People's Republic of China.
Yeah.
Whose more obligation is it? Is it like an overall universal moral, or is it just like China who's doing the moral? Like who's deciding what's moral or not? Like is it where is that?
So I actually think this is debatable. I think that if you are neg, you can make an argument that like maybe it is because China is the actor in the resolution, they have like some sort of state obligation to the people, and that's why they should prioritize economic growth. I don't know. We'll talk about that tomorrow, or Sam will. Or no, wait, we also talked about that today somewhat. Or you can talk about it in terms of like, because climate change and like economic impacts are something that affect the entire world, what China does is not just a moral action for China, but is also a moral action like for the rest of the world, because it affects how everyone else lives. Okay, so it's up to interpretation.
We'll be talking about that a lot on like framework discussion.
Okay, what time is it? True. Okay. Yeah, I'm also talking a lot about this. You can also just literally not run this argument if you don't feel like it. I'm just bringing up things that might come up in a debate. Yeah, so soft power happens. Maybe there's an argument you can make here on negative that's like, if China loses their ability to like have soft power over these nations, so like after they stop the BRI, in the instance in which you need to prioritize environmental protection, then that means that they are going to turn to worse things instead. Like maybe they'll expand their military power in the region. So maybe you can also think about arguments on this topic about what happens after China does something, which is not just the immediate impacts of like poverty or reducing climate change, but also how is China going to react? How are other countries going to react? How are citizens in China going to react? Stuff like that. Yeah, the last point is just like more info about the BRI, which is that China's also doing this to help the less developed regions of China. So does anyone recognize the Xinjiang region? A little bit?
It sounds familiar, but I don't know from where.
Okay. Do you know?
It's the region where an ethnic minority, the Uyghurs live, and it said that China is oppressing them and causing a cultural genocide against them.
Yes, real. That is happening there. Yeah, so maybe if you want to talk about like ethnic minorities, that's a reason to, or that's like some specificity you have. Like that's where Uyghurs typically live. So maybe integrating the economy of the Xinjiang region with the rest of China could be good. There are also reasons why that could be bad. I don't know. If you really want to look into it, you can. And if you want to talk about certain marginalized populations in China, that's a route you could go down.
Okay.
Yep. So
Start.
yeah. So we're gonna be going over some ideas for F and neg strategies, some things you can look at, or some ideas for cases. But first, we're gonna break out into groups. So let's go into. There's gonna be 2 groups of 3 and 1 group of 4. and we'll just have you kind of talk amongst yourselves about what you think the most compelling arguments are that you have going around in your brain right now, and come back to us with 3 ideas or 3 arguments that you think are particularly compelling.
Question: 3 on both sides or 3 total?
3 in general. So we'll go Heidi, Kira, Jack, Dwyer, Jair, and then 4. And we'll get back to you once the minute hand is like in between the 9 and the 10.
Consider using the whiteboards.
Yes.
They're
Brainstorm.
Plenty of markers all around the room. If you want a marker, come up to us.
Whiteboards are fun. You can draw things.
Yeah.
They're built different.
Yeah.
At least find one argument on both sides.
Yeah.
But
So you can't do like 3 affirmative arguments or 3 negative arguments. It has to be like 2, 1.
yeah, you can figure out the split. Fuck yourself.
When you come up with an argument, also write down reasons why the argument is true and reasons why the argument matters.
So the resolution is basically in support, if you're on math, you're supporting environmental protection over economic growth.
Still 40. Or 48.
I referenced stuff from last season. Let's make it feel that.
Base. There's a third side. Do you wanna?
Is there a timer going? Is there a timer going?
Looking at the clock.
Oh.
Oh.
Road initiative is producing a lot of emissions. As such, it is something that would be affected by doing the app. So if we were to protect the environment, then we lose out on maybe the impacts of the BRI. Second thing is that the BRI has also, you could just like literally not run this argument if you don't want to, even though it is like a significant part of China's economic strategy. A maybe more significant part is like its manufacturing industry. And so if you want to run a whole case that does not even talk about the BRI, you should still be prepared to hear that argument because someone else might run it. But if you want to prioritize other arguments, like maybe how domestic impacts affect the least well off, then you should do that. Basically just run what you like talking about.
Okay, and then the final negative.
Oh yeah, for the negative, we have China innovation, specifically dealing with like stuff like carbon capture, can decrease the harms of the say emissions and lessening the impacts of climate change. And this can also tie into the second part with the second thing, which is like poverty and like how can lead, for example, well into housing.
Mm-hmm.
And how since the contention one can kind of help reduce it and help also like reduce possible effects of climate change on people who are still impoverished around the world,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah. And oh, go ahead.
Can you explain to us what carbon capture is for those who don't know?
It's practically, in simple terms, you put a big machine and it filters out carbon dioxide from the air and it captures it and seals it into what it's exactly called, but it just sucks out practically carbon dioxide and takes it and seals it and I don't know what it's called.
Real. So it like speaks to the environment. I think you can. Is it reusable? I feel like it is. I feel like it.
Yeah, like I think it is like with like toothpaste or something like that.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that's like an example of climate innovation. If you want to look into that.
Yeah. Another good thing to back this up is that there are like so many examples of like every industry where technological innovation has made it more efficient and less like energy like taxing. And so you probably want to look at those as examples of economic growth spurring innovation in industries leading to better environmental standards. Okay. And then last up.
I think it's more useful to have offense, like all in offense, because if you're kind of playing the middle ground, you're kind of just like I feel like it's just better to say like as like an analytic, like
Yeah.
the neg is like assuming that I'm doing this.
Yeah, like what I'd say is that you don't necessarily like in case need to specify, but like you should probably explain like as an observation or something, saying that, and we'll get into those later, that just because we're prioritizing something doesn't mean we're like full stop trying to like throw away every economic advantage in sake of protecting the environment or like shirking all environmental regulations to boost the economy. Like I feel like it's fair to just argue that because it's prioritizing it, that means in the long run, throughout the majority of instances that occur when they're in conflict, China is going to prefer economic protection or it's going to prefer economic growth.
Plus, I think arguments like that are more defensive than offensive. So in your case, you definitely want to avoid like.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, that's why you want to include it as an observation, because it's a bit easier to just like bring up in rebuttal. That like, yeah, like the negative is citing all these bad impacts that like prioritizing the environment will happen, but understand it's not like the majority of cases, and it just like prefaces a potential defensive argument you can make, while your entire contention level it should be garnering offense for you. If that answers the question. Okay.
Okay, mine's next. China's got a pretty shady record with human rights, and increasing their economic power makes them less vulnerable to international economic or individuals or countries trying to help their human rights record through economic sanctions or what have you. Also gives them more tools to advance their human rights power and continue to oppress upon minorities, and shields them from that international scorn. So if you were to have that in a subpoint, or have that in a second contention and combine it with a point about climate change generally being worse off for minorities or for the oppressed, you could put together a case with this specific flow about resisting.
Okay, so basically that like the economic power that China gains allows it to like shirk off any preventative measures against its human rights abuses. Okay, question. So that's assuming China like wants is going to continue doing these bad things and wants to gain power, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So there we talked about soft power a lot with economic power. Okay, if China still wants to pursue like power and having strength in the international system, but it's not doing it through economic means, does that mean it's going to just not want to be powerful?
How do you mean not want to be powerful?
Like, what other avenues would China likely pursue to gain power in the international community if it's not through economic means?
I mean, there are other alternatives towards gaining that power, but what this does is if they are allowed to get more economically powerful and economically independent, transition from an industrial to a post-industrial economy where they wouldn't be as vulnerable to outside economic measures, you just don't have that international check, or as great of an international check on the human rights abuses.
Okay.
For Neg, just simply for like the scope of it, like obviously we don't have research into it, but like China obviously has a large influence on the world, not just in like overall influence, but also in trade and its role in world economies. So obviously decreasing its power in such a way, especially when you can still prioritize the environment on Neg, it seems like that would have a huge really bad impact for countless countries across the world.
How so?
I mean, we haven't like researched any specifics, but like with African countries, China may be their only ways to gain
Mhm.
to try to develop. So, taking away that influence really negatively impact them. Also in terms of like trade, again, like we talked about, if the prices go up, make the least advantaged not able to afford things. There's like a lot of different impacts.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah, so as you can see, there's a lot of different arguments that people are going to come up with, and it's likely that you might not have like voiced every single idea you might have, or you might come up with more when researching the topic or looking at frameworks. So just know there's a lot of ground and different ways you can go about addressing the resolution, and no strategy is like completely right or wrong.
You know, guys.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, and now we'll be going through some ideas for AF arguments that some of you may have touched on already, and then we'll be doing negative arguments. So we're going to be looking at how you can leverage climate change and the idea of like prioritizing the environment being a prerequisite to economic benefits. And then we're going to look into like an idea for an AF that combines them. Okay, so talking about climate change. So you can talk about prioritizing environmental protection is key to protecting people from the effects of climate change. And so this is something we've addressed a lot already. It doesn't just affect China, but it affects like the entire world. And a couple things to know about this is China consumes more coal than like the rest of the world combined, and it's responsible for nearly 30% of emissions. So when we're looking at China's contribution to the climate crisis on a global scale, China makes up a big chunk of it. And you can look at the graph that Catherine showed as an example of that. So when you're looking at the effects that prioritizing what the effects of like protecting the environment can have, it can make actual substantial gains when it comes to the climate crisis and protecting not just people in China but the entire world. So you have a lot of access to impacts. Like a lot of people will talk about something that a specific country should do to curb climate change, and then they're going to talk about how climate change affects all of these people across the world. But they never really show why that one specific country doing this one specific thing is going to solve the climate crisis. And I'm not saying China prioritizing environmental protection is going to solve it, but it definitely has a lot more ground to make gains than other countries would. And then also impacts. The impacts are not just located in like worldwide, but also towards the people in China. China is experiencing more droughts and floods due to the climate change, and this leads to mass death, starvation, and economic loss. This is kind of like what we touched on before, like China deals with dust storms due to like tilling, and also just in general, not prioritizing environmental protections can lead to more climate catastrophes that occur, such as droughts and floods, and that does upset the economic structure and put more people in poverty and lead to all those bad effects we talked about. Another argument you can make is that prioritizing environmental protection is a prerequisite. So the idea for this is that like economic growth is okay as long as it serves the end goal of protecting the environment. And what I mean by this is like environmental growth is good, but that doesn't go far enough. It's not just prioritizing economic growth for the sake of economic growth, but leveraging economic growth insofar as it protects the environment. And so there are ways to access what China is currently doing or has said it's going to do. It has a goal to be carbon neutral by 2060, and it has a plan that it submitted to shift towards renewable energy and green technology. Obviously, there's debate if they're actually going to follow through on this or not, but once again, it shows that the like ability to do so is there. And once again, like when we're debating about ought and a moral obligation, whether or not they're actually going to do the thing is a lot more, doesn't matter as much as if they can do the thing and what effects that is going to have. And then this is really good because you're able to avoid a lot of the negative arguments about the necessity of economic growth by instead advocating for economic growth and just hammering the idea that environmental protection doesn't necessarily mean that it leads to harms for the economy in the long run. And that can lead to, like what we talked about before, a lot of technologies that happen through innovation are a lot more efficient, which means they are able to produce more, but they also do have less impacts on the environment. So by prioritizing environmental protection, making these technologies more sustainable, we're also at the same time able to make them more efficient for people and make life better. And then last is like an idea for like an inequality graph. So climate change disproportionately affects marginalized groups, and it can exacerbate inequality. We've talked about this a lot extensively. It affects access to food, and the marginalized are disproportionately impacted by things such as heat waves and flooding and all the effects it brings. And another thing is a general response to why we need to prioritize environmental protection over economic growth is the idea for this is you're framing specifically that when we're looking at the actions that China makes, we need to look at how it affects the least well-off in society. And then your case says that prioritizing protecting the environment better protects those who are the least like benefited compared to economic growth. So there's a quote that says economic growth doesn't help everyone equally. And so and specifically economic development and economic growth doesn't mean it's evenly distributed across the country. And China is so vast that what may benefit one region economically may harm it in another. And this is from someone that helped with China's first national climate strategy in 2013. So this person like understands the effects that its like climate change strategy has throughout the country and how the infrastructure functions. So it kind of shows by just looking at economic improvements as a general idea and like increasing GDP, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to affect all places equally or help those who actually need it.
Also, like with like the different metrics of economic growth, there's obviously like infrastructure, but if your opponent is like talking about a lot of things like you said GDP, it's not necessarily equivalent that the same people are getting the benefits. Like when we think of like when the Dow Jones goes up by like 10 points, the people like working class people don't necessarily benefit from the Dow going up.
Yeah. And so it just kind of shows that, like, if you can show that economic growth is something that's really vague and doesn't necessarily relate to what the negative is trying to show it is, you can show that economic growth as like a principle to prioritize doesn't put those who need help the most in like first place to try and help them. And then obviously it gets into debate about the types of strategies China would employ. Like we talked about their manufacturing industry, and that does affect people who like won't be able to transition jobs and who are normally on the lower end of the economic scale. So you want to like find specifics about how prioritizing environmental protection in China can help the least well off, and specifically prepare examples that the negative might bring up about how that's not the case. And then there's one final thing that talks about why inequality needs to be prioritized. And it's a study that talks about how inequality is hampering China's progress. And basically the idea is that when inequalities arise, it leads to certain social strains in society, and it doesn't allow China to be as prosperous as it potentially could be if these inequalities were reduced. And yeah?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay. And you can pull on, like, there are studies that show this, like, worldwide, where inequality leads to, like, more social strain and not as stable of a society. And then you can look at specific examples, like what the link there, which you can look up in Classroom later, that shows how it specifically applies to China. And one final thing to note, yeah?
Can you talk about how that specifically relates to environmental protection?
Yeah. So specifically when we're looking at economic growth, and that'll tie into environmental protection. So the idea is we need to prioritize the least well off, and normally that the least well off do have an unequal standing in society. Economic growth isn't looking at reducing inequalities necessarily. It might lift people out of poverty, but imagine if, okay, let's say the poverty line is like $10, and I'm lifted out of poverty. I go from 0 to 10, but at the same time, the people who are at like 10 go to 1,000. Like, there's still inequality there that occurs, and it leads to strains on society with economic growth. With environmental protection, the issue is not prioritizing the environment leads to exacerbating damages, like it leads to exacerbating the effects that it has on the least off in societies, like droughts, floods, all these negative effects, which is just going to increase the social strain, hamper the progress. So like the prioritizing economic growth, that growth and prosperity isn't going to be nearly as effective as it could be if we didn't tackle the environmental crisis first, because we need to tackle inequality. Does that kind of answer the question? Yep. Okay, and lastly on affirmative points is be specific. So you want to look at specific industries that are going green or strategies that China's kind of talked about. Like, we've already addressed this a lot. You want to talk about specific harms the population is currently experiencing and like where these policies are more likely to occur. We've talked about the manufacturing industry as an example. More likely than not, a lot of the policies that will be implemented when we're prioritizing this is going to be or affect the manufacturing industry. So you want to look at where the impacts are most likely to happen, because you don't want to cherry pick like random things that are not as likely to happen as a general policy prescription. Then the negative can access instead of like, here are like specific industries where economic growth has helped people, where prioritizing environmental protection is going to harm them. So when you can look at specific industries and tell the judge how those industries are going to be affected and how the people in those industries are going to be effective, that makes a much more compelling case. Okay. And then negative arguments. So we're going to be looking at how you can talk about quality of life as a general standard of well-being and how the negative betters it, and talk about innovation, and then hegemony, which is like relates to soft power and hard power. So on quality of life. So China has averaged GDP growth of 10% since the 80s, and like Catherine brought up, 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty thanks to them prioritizing economic growth and then reforms they made. So this means there's more job opportunities for people, and it allows for an improved economy equals improved infrastructure. And that ties back to everything we've talked about before, where people have more access to material goods, they have more access to recreational activities, which improves quality of life. and it can support hospitals and emergency services. And all that is thanks to prioritizing the economy, allowing for this investment in society. Yeah?
Still something about the arguments. I'm just curious, who's gonna be judging us?
Us.
And do you guys have a big enough staff to judge all of them?
Uh,
Two other people.
yeah, we have more people coming. But like all of them have had experience with LD, so you're not gonna like have a lay judge thrown at you.
Practice rounds though will be flighted, so it'll just be us three, but you'll have rounds back to back.
Yes.
Okay, so like in regards to that, how far is like too far going into an argument? So like there's kind of like a rabbit hole where you're like back and forth, like how
Yeah.
far is too
Okay, so what I'd say is it depends. On the negative, it might not be beneficial to go super in depth just because you have like 3 minutes or 3:30 to talk about like specific like industry or specific thing. Like it just depends on the impacts that it has. Like if you're talking or going super in depth on the manufacturing industry and all the ways that prioritizing environmental protection is going to harm the manufacturing industry, decrease jobs, force people out of it, force them into poverty, and you go like just make one contention about it, like it's feasible. Like that can be a negative case. But on the affirmative case, generally the strategy I go with is I prioritize the in-depth arguments in case compared to like a potential rebuttal I can make on the negative, because the affirmative case allows you a lot more to flesh out like warrants and impacts and really explore stuff. And when you're able to do that, it makes it a lot easier to extend it through your rebuttals because you have such a short time to do it. Going more in depth in the affirmative constructive allows you to do less work in the 1AR that you need to pull through that argument and make it make sense for the judge and make it effective.
Another thing is like when you build an argument in your case, like you do not have to do this much impacting. Like you can say, I have like poverty happens, and then in your next speeches you can explain why that is so bad because you can do that. So if you are like, if you want to save time in your case, then just end it at the poverty thing and explain why it's so bad later when you are choosing which arguments that you want to prioritize or that you think are going to win you the round.
Yeah. Okay, and then obviously at the very bottom there, Belt and Road Initiative. That's improving quality of life for the people in those developing countries because it's allowing them to build up their infrastructure and access all the things talked about before. Improved economy improves infrastructure.
Also, one thing about the BRI I forgot to mention, there's also a question of whether or not these projects actually get developed. Like in, I think Kenya, there's like a road to nowhere where like China will start projects and not actually finish them. That's also something you can look into.
Isn't there something like that in Afghanistan too, where there's like supposed to be a big trading and a bunch of countries put in money to like finish it and then it never finishes. People just don't finish it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know specifically about Afghanistan, but that's an important thing to show, like, how often do the projects that China says are, like, going to get made actually get made. And, yeah. Okay, innovation. So, we've talked about this a lot already. Innovation is necessary to continue to progress China's economic growth. And innovation improves efficiency, it saves lives. For example, agricultural innovation can improve food security and allow for better technologies to increase crop yield to function for the increasing population. One like specific link you can have on this, like why innovation is so necessary and why innovation only occurs through economic growth, is that China's like population is in a really interesting place where like their aging population is leaving the workforce, and so their like labor force is decreasing, which means they have less people to do more work than they need to before, which means that technology needs to get more efficient and better at doing its job to accommodate for it, which shows why we need to prioritize economic growth. Okay. Hey, pursue. Okay. Okay. And
wait, lunch is at 5:40 now for dinner. Sorry.
5:40.
Yeah, we'll leave at 5:40 because we're staggering the.
Oh, okay.
okay. It's like 5:25.
Yes.
No
So
clue.
we're just staggering when we go, so we don't all.
Oh, okay. Okay. And last up,
So, wait, Sam, can you check the mic's on?
it is.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Samuel said that he could really only hear pursuit, so like I guess we're like you to like project it a bit more or something.
Yeah, no.
That's a
I
myth.
don't know.
No, that's
Maybe
just not true.
it's just like.
Okay, the mic likes pursuing, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, and then last up is hegemony negative. So this is like kind of what we talked about before with like power that China pursues, something that was touched on over here with like economic power. And so this goes a bit in depth. So the idea is like, so first of all, what is hegemony? So hegemony is basically the political, economic, or military dominance of a state compared to other state actors in the international community. And this takes two forms. First is soft power, and that's what we talked about before with the Belt and Road Initiative and the trade deals. Is that building up economic power and trade relations with other countries allows you to leverage your interests without picking up a gun and forcing the country to do what you want to do. And the other type of power is hard power, which is military power. And so when countries can't pursue soft power or find hard power to be more appealing, they're going to pick up a gun and try and leverage their power and interests in other ways. Because a country isn't just going to give up all of its interests, it's going to try and pursue its possible avenues. And so the argument that the negative makes is essentially economic growth is necessary to preserve China's soft power. And so the Belt and Road Initiative will improve China's standing and expand trade with all these developing countries. And it needs to, basically China needs to stay on par with the European Union and the United States to achieve its interests and be competitive with them. Like we see this all the time in the news talking about the US and its relationship to China. And then China's able to influence its neighbors and expand its influence through trade rather than forcing them through violent means. And so it's good. And so the downside of like you might be thinking like, why is this a good thing that China is able to like leverage its power for its own benefit? And the reason that it is because the alternative is way worse. So basically the argument would be prioritizing economic protections harms China's soft power, and it's going to force China to militarize and assert its dominance in regions through military means. And so there's an article here that you can look into later if this interests you, and it's basically saying that, yeah?
Is it supposed to say environmental protections?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, that's supposed to be environmental. It's fine. Basically, ignore that. But yeah, it's environmental protections. So basically what it's saying is China has two paths to pursuing its interests. One is through like building up its economy and leveraging its trade. And the other way is through militarizing and asserting like force. And this leads to a lot of bad things. When China militarizes, it can lead to risk of war and instability in the region. We see this a lot of talk right now with like Taiwan and China, and likely with other regions it could get worse, or China could amp its efforts up with Taiwan and in other regions because it doesn't have the ability to leverage it through soft power. And so an important thing to know about this is that you don't necessarily have to defend China to make this argument. You can still like value quality of life or justice or whatever, and you just say China taking this route is far better for quality of life, because the other alternative is that China is going to like result in militarization and like risk war for people. So you don't necessarily need to say like China pursuing its interest is good and this is the best way to do it. You can just say that this is the way that prevents potential massive loss of life. And you could still technically like justify China's actions and say China being like the global superpower is amazing and here's how to do it. And that's just a framing thing, and we'll touch on both options in the lecture that will be brought up tomorrow. And okay, we've gone through 6 different potential arguments, af, neg, and then all of the ones listed here. So you have a lot of options, but please try to think of original arguments too, or expand on the ones that have been provided to you. We've gone pretty in depth on a lot of different things, from the Belt and Road Initiative to soft power to the industries that China has and how to be effective. So the biggest thing is you can talk about climate change still, obviously, but try and like be specific in your case and show specific industries, specific impacts, and make your case unique.
I have, oh, right. I just have a quick question. So, the side that we decided this, is that going to be the case at Blue
Yes.
So
Like, so we'll just work on like if you were assigned negative, negative.
yes.
Yeah.
And then you can, if you think of affirmative arguments that you also want to run, then you can like maybe write this down somewhere. But you don't have to finish that case until like 2 days after you have to finish the case that you are working on right now. This is a pretty quick turnaround. You need it done by Monday.
You will be given time in class to like work on it and do one-on-ones.
So, speaking of original arguments, what's your opinion on like case?
Okay.
Uh,
So
yeah.
I overheard this over there. So to be clear, a K is a specific type of argument that is structured in a specific way. Saying that capitalism is bad is not the same as running a K. So Ks are obviously looked down upon in South Dakota. I have a funny story about one that I ran into one on. If you want to hear that. But the idea is that like a K is like a specific type of argument where it just sort of references the structure of the argument, right? So if you want to make an argument that the reason why we should prefer environmental protection all the time is just straight up because capitalism is just bad, irregardless, you can make that argument in a contention. Considerations that you can take into account are one, like what circuit you're in. I know that all three of us will definitely listen to that argument.
Mhm.
If you're in South Dakota, obviously you should maybe be wary of that. I know you're from Rapid City, so your circuit is different. I think that in South Dakota, or like in our side of South Dakota, you can. I think you can run that because I have in like contention forms that are like structured in like a traditional LD way, and you can still win on them if you justify them well. I have no idea what your circuit looks like. Neither do I for like Oregon or Wisconsin. No. Yes, Wisconsin. So that's just a consideration you can take into mind. Second thing is if you want to run the argument, like if you just like feel like you want to talk about capitalism, then just like do it. I think debate should ultimately be fun. Given that like we will listen to it, and if you want to run it, you should. Like I don't know. But those are like two maybe competing things, like competitive success and whether you care about it.
So, can I run K's at this tournament?
Okay, nobody here knows how to write a K, except for maybe you, because you did novice policy for a year. So like, if you want to do the work at like searching up K structure, go ahead. Like, you probably should not do that. You should probably just do a traditional case. But if you want to run a K argument, so like if you want to run that capitalism is bad, just run it in a contention and like explain it the way you would a regular contention. So like warrant impact or stuff like that.
Any questions?
Great.
Okay, to be clear, your assignment is nothing right now. Like if you want to do research tonight, feel free to. You don't have to. You will be given time tomorrow to write your case and we'll do one-on-ones with you. But maybe start like brainstorming in your mind arguments that you want to run. Yes. What else?
I don't have much. That's the end of the slides for that.
Oh, also, do not over-prepare. Like, if you're someone who writes a ton of blocks and you like being very prepared against many responses, you probably should like you don't have enough time to do that. So if you want to stay up until 5 a.m. each night, like that's your prerogative. But like, I personally enjoy sleeping. Also, we kind of want to focus on being able to generate arguments in round against things that you may not be like super familiar with, as opposed to preparing arguments beforehand. Yeah, that's fine.
How do I stop the stream?
Oh.
All right, so we're gonna talk about contentions more, and yeah. So what we talked about before was that they should tell stories, they should include link chains, and they should operate as arguments, affirming or negating, and evidence should be used, doesn't necessarily have to be. So diving deeper into contentions, we're gonna look at 4 areas. Of course, we're gonna look at what link chains means more specifically. We're gonna talk about end quotes. We're gonna talk about strategies, and we're gonna talk about uniqueness. All right, so let's look at this example that was put on the other lecture of A, B, and C. In terms of like when we talked about making links, like the poverty to baby formula to housing, etc., can someone raise their hand and tell me how these link together, just like in any way? And just read the taglines, don't read the cards.
Can you guys read this?
Can you read that?
No. Okay.
All right.
Wait.
All right, we'll skip that. So I'll give you the answers. So there's a centralized focus on all three subpoints being civilian deaths.
Can you explain what the arguments were?
Yeah. So subpoint A is talking about like a civilian whose family member got killed by a targeted strike. Subpoint B is talking about how targeted killings have drastically like made civilian life more dangerous. And subpoint C talks about like the harm it has to civilians because life is more dangerous. Kind of like a quality of life argument. So important attributes is that there's a centralized focus to all three subpoints being civilian deaths. There's a flow to the subpoints as like they all like link to each other. And like this is more specifically like it outlines an issue caused by targeted killings. B marks uniqueness, C marks the magnitude of the impact, and we'll talk about uniqueness more specifically, obviously. And this flow is what we mean by a link chain. So this type of flow is what you want to have in each contention that you run. So link chains, for a more specific definition, is the central idea that one subpoint leads to another. In the example given, it was established that targeted killings lead to civilian deaths in subpoint A. So if this link chain wasn't necessarily leading to another huge impact, like in the example Catherine was talking about with poverty, it was poverty, baby formula housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the example that was shown was more so the resolution is causing this, and these impacts are bad because of X, Y, Z. So instead of A leading to B leading to C, it was the resolution leading to A, B, C. And this is a valid strategy for link chains in LD because you need to have moral weight or a link to the framework. So you need to prove how like this impact like matters in terms of the framework. So you can't necessarily just be like, I guess you could, but you would want a little bit more than just poverty leads to lack of baby formula leads to lack of food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Link it to your framework.
I think most of the time, okay, if you're running like utilitarianism, if you've never done LD or you're switching, it's just like, it's how most of us think of arguments, which is like, you just like, which one has the worst consequences? Then you probably don't have to be like, like these are the reasons why it has the worst consequences. If you're running a framework that's like, I'm doing this one particular thing, so I'm creating more justice in the world, then you need to like explain explicitly why something becomes more fair. So like these are impacts that relate to like general consequences. If you're running something more specific, then the things that you talk about also need to be more specific.
Any questions on that? Okay. So it's like not necessary to have 15 subpoint contentions that lead to nuclear war, nor is it expected. So yeah. So the types of links you want to avoid, and by links we're kind of using these synonymously as like subpoint arguments. So you want to avoid non-specific links. So like contention 1, targeted killings are unjust. In the example given, the resolution is literally asking you if they're unjust. So saying your contention 1 is yes, the resolution is true is not specific enough to be an actual good link. Which is what this bullet point is saying. It's too vague. It's like you're literally just like saying yes to the resolution. You need to delve deeper and find a specific and impactful more reason to reject the resolution or affirm the resolution. Avoid links that give no offense or impacts. We kind of got into this before we broke off for supper. I think Jagger, you asked the question if you should like have an example that says you can do this. So that's what we talk about, like defense. You don't need to do this. You don't. It's like it's not necessary to have a whole subpoint dedicated to describing what the contention is referring to, or that's like a definition thing. So don't do that. But it's also like you don't need to have defensive arguments within your case structure. So like if the neg side or the neg position was targeted killings do not cause civilian deaths, and they put that as a contention, that wouldn't be one that would give them a lot of offense. So with links, don't play defensively. Look for things that garner offense.
Does everyone know the difference between offense and defense? Okay.
Cool. Some more links you want to avoid. This one's kind of obvious. A link with no relation to the other subpoints. Obviously, if you like have a contention about civilian deaths, you shouldn't have a card talking about environmental harms caused by drone strikes unless you link the two somehow. So keep link chains strategic and specific. Each card should give you something in terms of offense. Again, don't play defensively when writing cases. That's a typo. So, key takeaways with link chains. These are how you tell a story through the contention level, and it's also how you make your case flow better. So you want to like make it so that subpoints relate to another and relate to the condition itself. And again, link chains in LD don't necessarily follow the res leads to A leads to B leads to nuclear war approach. This is what we talked about with Deont and consequential, or what Catherine was mentioning. So this is fine, but in LD you need you need to relate to the framework. But like Catherine said, if you're running a consequentialist framework, either like link chain is fine. So link chain should be synonymous with contention. This should be like the most important key takeaway. Like you should think of contentions as just giant link chains because every single contention must utilize one to be effectively flowy. Yeah.
I feel like we do our practice running with the competition. Are we going to have
Yeah.
Yes. Wait.
well, I
Like-
was just wondering.
like,
our
okay.
prep time to use.
Yeah. So you might have noticed something within these examples that we gave, and it's the giant end quote at the bottom. We briefly touched on this before supper as well, so we'll delve deeper into it. So this just verbally indicates to the judge that you finished reading a card and that you're going to read analysis in the case. The purpose of these are to implicate something from the card. So in the example shown earlier, we see end quote implicate the dehumanization of civilians through drone strikes, which is strategic through a deontological framework. But don't use these after every single card if it's not necessary.
Wait, can I give an example of this on this topic?
Sure.
Okay. That's like a lot of words. We also haven't talked about deontology yet. This
Yes.
is kind of it. Okay, if we have, okay, we have a card from Pursuit 22 that says, that climate change destroys the economy. And it's like, climate change, bad, agriculture down, food up, economy down. Okay, that's what happens in the card. What would you put as like an end quote to clarify why this is like important in the round? This is also a candy option.
Yep.
Yes.
If climate change is like directly harming the economy, then we have an obligation to like help offset climate change because not only does it help the environment, but it also helps the economy.
Yeah, so something like that, how it does both. I would also phrase it in terms of like literal like in the round or in the debate, why does this matter? So like you're making a root cause claim, which is like, what does this mean for this for negative? So like you literally say this matters because this happens to negative or this happens to affirmative, or like some burden is happening in the round now. And you would say like, so even if it is true that economic growth is good, climate change is the root cause of why economic growth can even happen. So if this doesn't happen, this can't happen. So to make it like very clear for your judge, like ordering arguments and like, I don't know, and structuring it in terms of the debate is what like implicated quotes should do.
So some other advantages that these can give you is that it could help your case flow more smoothly between framework and contention. So a lot of the times, like, there might be, like, a lot of things, like, when you're reading cards, there might be things that get boggled down or get lost. So when you're having so many raw numbers thrown at you, it's kind of nice to have something to simplify and summarize what just, like, happened, or not summarize, but more so implicate. The other point here is that, like, using analysis to implicate moral harms is also very important. Like, we've brought up many times that you don't necessarily, like, need to use, like, philosophy to, like, warrant specific things. Like, in the framework itself, you can have analysis to support your value criterion. It can also help lay judges understand the round better if you have something like summarized or implicating. If you're implicating the cards for them, you're letting them know what they should be taking away from each contention. But there are also pretty significant disadvantages with these things. First, and like most obviously, they can slow you down if you are reading one after every card. This is a mistake I used to make, is I just like threw them on after every card and it was not good. So try to limit these to only after like a contention, if ever, because you don't really need to be like implicating something from each card when you should just be getting like the general message of the contention in an end quote. Another disadvantage is that these don't really provide real offense in a round. These are like useful to help you implicate offense off your own cards, but this is something you should have already done while doing debate prep. Like you should know what offense each card gives you, or each contention gives you. So it's not really new offense that you're garnering through these things. And it could also be redundant. So for judges who are paying attention to the case and are like experienced judges, having to hear the card that they just understood be summarized for another 15 seconds definitely takes them a little bit out of the speech. So avoid redundancy. And some key takeaways is that they're a method to increase connectivity between framework and contention level. They should only be used to implicate certain harms, otherwise they are redundant. At the bottom line, use EQs sparingly and efficiently, avoid redundancy, and if you're debating the necessity of an EQ on one of your cards or contentions, chances are you don't need it. So always err on the side of not including one. All right, some strategies that that you can utilize with contentions is contention ordering. So when most of you guys debate, do you guys go like top to bottom, like framework, contention 1, contention 2? Right, so that's what most debaters
I
do.
actually start with contention 3.
Okay, that's what most debaters do. So they will go down the flow in order, meaning they'll go to framework, go to contentions, ordered by 1, 2, and 3. So what you can use this to your advantage is if you order your strongest contention as the third contention, which means that your opponent like literally gets to that contention last, and that means they have like the least amount of time to address this argument. You can also use root cause claims, which Catherine mentioned just now, which are essentially talking about how the argument that it's the argument that your opponent's argument fails to address the root cause, which you are addressing. This is also known as a link turn, or like turn. So if the opponent is running poverty and you're running capitalism, you can claim root cause because you're addressing the root cause and they're not really addressing the root cause.
Wait. I have a question. Why wouldn't I put my strongest argument at the top if, like, maybe it's the one that can weather responses the best?
That's also a valid strategy, but the idea is that like if you have your worst, like strongest contention at the last spot, you can kind of kick the other two or not respond to them as effectively and just focus on the third contention.
Okay, yeah. To be clear, I think in debate, a lot of you probably learned it as like flow debate, or like you need to respond to everything to win the round. There are many cases in which you can straight up not respond to like a major argument, which is called kicking. And so that's why this strategy is useful. If you have an argument at the top that you know you're not going to rely on to win, then in your second rebuttal, or even in your first rebuttal, you can like say literally like 2 seconds of things about it. Let your opponent win the defense off of it. So they prove why it's wrong, but that doesn't give them any offense, just by proving your like first contention wrong. And so if you have your strongest contention later, and they haven't responded to it, you can garner much more offense off of it, and rely on that to win instead.
All right, so we're gonna talk about uniqueness. Hopefully you guys can read this. Yes? No? I'm gonna assume that's a yes. So what about this card, like, symbolizes uniqueness to you guys? Yeah.
He talks about how like it's not an incident that happens once, so like it's something that's for its relevancy, and isn't just like cherry picking.
Right. So that's like the crux of what uniqueness is just proving that the contention is like the primary driving factor for like what the harm you are talking, like what the harm is. So that's what that definition is. Uniqueness is just the idea that the contention argument is a primary driver of the impact. Specificity works very well with uniqueness because it's much easier to find uniqueness within specific arguments. So like, can anyone tell me what's the unique driving factor behind poverty and racism? And there isn't one. So it's not like there are, but like there's multiple. So you want to have specific arguments that have specific impacts so that you can avoid like this issue. Uniqueness can also refer to how interconnected the impact is to the resolution. So ideally, all contentions should adhere to this because your contention should be relating to should be a product of what the resolution is causing. So X harm arises from environmental policies, for example, in this resolution. In terms of finding uniqueness, you shouldn't really have an issue if your arguments are specific enough, but you don't necessarily need an author to tell you this as well. You can kind of reason out uniqueness within your own arguments, like by just using your own analysis. So we're going to do an example of this. The resolution is the benefits of cheese in society outweigh the harms. And I gave you an example. So that's the example, is because lactose intolerant populations uniquely damage society's bathrooms. So I want you guys to think of arguments that utilize uniqueness relating to this resolution. Should they get in the same groups as last time?
Yes.
All right, same
Wait, no.
groups.
No.
Okay.
We should mix them up.
All right. How should we mix up groups?
You can number them.
Okay. 1, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. I don't know. I thought. Okay. Everyone got that? Okay. Ones, twos, threes.
Okay, well, we just wrote text, but like, how much longer do you guys need?
Oh, we don't need that much time. This is your last slide.
This is the last.
Okay.
Okay, because Samir said be done by 8:10, break for 5 minutes, and then meet in the den for a meeting, and then labs begin at 8:15.
Okay.
Wait, do they just sit here?
I think they're just free to like go wherever.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
Wait,
it's
don't
like,
we need to come
or
back and
break
tell
time,
them?
like as in they go to the bathroom and all that kind of stuff. So.
But they stay in this room.
They stay in the
I think
building.
I mean,
stay in the building. Stay in the building. Yeah. I think they can go like down to like the
Two-
gate.
All right. I'm gonna assume you guys are done. So,
We will do one that's easier.
yeah, this might have been a bit.
It's difficult, but
Vague,
also
but-
it makes for the funny joke that Christine made.
Yeah. So sorry.
The bathroom. Okay, yeah, that's on Christine.
My bad. Okay. Group 1.
I think you argued that it's usually beneficial to certain societies' cultures.
Perfect. Group 2.
Cheese is a moral good because the Green Bay Packers are the cheeseheads, and the Green Bay Packers are the best football team in the history of ever. So.
Okay. Sure.
So this is why we shouldn't use bias.
Group 3.
But he's an expert.
Yeah, it's only cheese that can be put on so many things: pasta, sandwiches, pizza.
That's
Yeah,
such a good.
that's-
That's a great one.
Okay. Yeah, you guys did fine on this.
I'm pro cheese.
I'm also pro cheese. All right. You want to come up with one?
I think
Okay.
this is absent.
I agree.
Yes.
I agree. Okay.
Let's come up with one for the topic so it's a little bit more useful for you guys while doing research.
Guys, what's an argument you like on this topic? Manufacturing bad. Okay.
Oh wait, I have one question. Sorry.
Yes.
That's like terrifying. So like, how would direct like legislation passed by at least like businesses in the US like China really? Like, is that like a party in charge of it?
Yeah, that's the party.
Okay, I got confused. What would legislation look like against like multinational corporations? So like McDonald's.
So are you asking what legislation is likely to pass, or what legislation like the app would prevent?
Like, how would that? Well, I'm just wondering if like those companies would be affected by things China passes. Like, are there manufacturing plants from McDonald's in China? Like, actually, I don't know.
I don't know.
I was thinking of McDonald's.
I don't know what China's relationship is with McDonald's. I mean,
Did they have like a good relationship with KFC?
I think that's Japan.
No, it's also China. Is it everywhere? And they also like peace.
wait, what is the question?
Sorry. Okay, so how would like this resolution on the outside affect? Would it affect at all multinational corporations or
Like
like
McDonald's.
Oh, if they're multinational, then probably not. I don't think China has jurisdiction to regulate like McDonald's globally. Like,
yeah, but like
or like
they're proper like
if there are McDonald's in China, I think I want to say that China has power
Yeah.
over those. Like, yeah, you can definitely like have, yeah, like you can decide like if you can allow states to build McDonald's, for example. So you still have like, I don't know, jurisdiction over that. I don't know if this debate is centered around like food franchises, although, but like you could still make those arguments, yeah. I would reward creativity. Okay, manufacturing bad. Okay. Uniqueness. Or like what?
So the
Why
argument.
is manufacturing uniquely bad as opposed to other things?
Yeah.
Causes a lot of CO2 emissions.
Yes. A lot of CO2.
Okay, I'm sorry, another question.
Yes.
Not McDonald's related.
Okay.
So, in this case, someone might argue it's not unique because automobiles create more pollution. Would you just respond by saying, well, if it uniquely creates these pollutants and
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
So you do two things.
Okay.
One, it uniquely creates a certain kind of pollutant. Secondly, uniqueness does not necessarily mean that it is the only thing that contributes to an impact. If you prove that it is like something that's significant towards an impact. So the idea, so like making a non-uniqueness argument, for example, if I were trying to answer this, like a non-uniqueness argument would be saying that manufacturing like literally doesn't even matter in terms of climate change. So if I was like, these things will fill in instead, like we'll do, I don't know, cars more. McDonald's,
So much.
in response
Cows that
to,
make the McDonald's burgers release more carbon emissions.
yes. Cows. Okay, and to be clear, in order for me to make a legitimate non-uniqueness response to this, I would have to be like, okay, when manufacturing goes down, what takes its place is that cows will get bred so much faster, and they'll increase emissions so greatly. Like the methane, like it'll be like insane, such that it fills the gap that this leaves. That would be like the correct way to make a non-uniqueness claim. If someone comes up here and they're like, this is non-unique because cars also cause carbon dioxide emissions, then you're like, okay, like I don't know, manufacturing is still like probably like in the top 3 causes of emissions, and so if you cut down this, you'll probably, even if it does not eliminate climate change, it is like in and of itself good because it reduces climate change significantly, and significantly enough such that health impacts still get better, or even if they don't get better, they at least don't get so much worse as it would in the alternative.
Yeah. Okay. So, what did we come up with that? You
What?
erased it.
What can I erase?
Oh, that's the only one we can. Okay, let's do like 2 more and then move on. Any
Yeah,
ideas?
why is manufacturing?
Yep.
I believe it creates like a huge reliance on like the coal industry because they like use that for fossil fuels.
Yep. China's like the #1 coal user,
Yeah.
so that's definitely unique.
This is good. because
Yeah.
it means that the stop like transitions to renewables.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the unique like block for why we're not doing something better.
Right. And one more.
Oh, we haven't been giving out candy.
Oh,
That's why they're not
yeah.
answering.
Sorry, guys.
Wait, who I forgot who answered. Oh.
I already-
So it's like a game system that's
Sure.
I don't know if I take this route, but depending on how the greatest like job conditions or like unionizing forces.
Okay, so maybe we can make an argument about job conditions. So maybe it's like manufacturing because of how like power structures work in the manufacturing industry. Then this industry is uniquely bad because we don't have like the power to unionize as opposed to other industries.
Yep.
I don't know if it is, but how manufacturing also helps gives to the transportation. Yeah, the transportation industry, like China being one of the biggest exporters
Mhm.
for the world.
Okay, so yeah, this is manufacturing is the unique cause as to all of the emissions that come from the transportation infrastructure you have to build around manufacturing. So obviously I need like boats and
Right.
planes and trucks to go between places and trains and boats and trucks to get between places in order to transport goods. So that will never go away unless we get rid of or unless we curb manufacturing.
All right. One more. Sure.
Well, I was just having a question. So, like, reliance on coal, is it unique to say that it's like a doom system since there's only like a limited amount of coal?
Yeah.
So eventually
Um,
we're gonna have to.
That's that would be the impact. Like the uniqueness is like that manufacturing is the reason why we cannot transition from coal because manufacturing is like reliant on coal. So this is like unique in that it is blocking access to this thing. And so there's no other way to transition to renewables unless we get rid of manufacturing. And then you would explain that that's bad because we're gonna run out of resources.
All right. Sweet. So that's it for us, basically. We have night activities. We have labs. Some deadlines we want to remind you guys of. Monday, finish the case on the side you were assigned. Does everyone remember the side they were assigned? Okay. And then Wednesday, right? Finish the other side. Is that correct?
Oh God. Yes.
Assume Wednesday. I think it's correct. Some reminders. Breakfast tomorrow. I
Okay.
think we're going to talk about this in lab, but you have to get up earlier than today. So just a warning.
Yes, look on your schedule via, I don't know, earlier than breakfast. You cannot leave. Okay, we're about to get into labs after this, and this will be different people than who's in here right now. So we're gonna come back in 8:15 and tell you about that. But that's basically for attendance. You cannot leave the dorm to go to eat breakfast until you are all accounted for in your labs.
Yes.
Snoozing? Well, okay, you
Yeah,
can
so-
eat breakfast. We'll figure that out. I don't know.
Well, can they?
Well, we probably would have to talk to someone about it and then like get clearance from.
We'll figure it out.
Anyways.
All right.
They said that they feel bad on your door.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We people will be doing room checks periodically, or not periodically. At 11. 11. No. Okay, 11 p.m. will be room checks. Lights out are at 11:30. Is that for you? You're at like 7 tonight. Sleep, please. Oh yeah.